Live from the SABC's Auckland Park studios in Johannesburg. Welcome to this Thursday edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvoko, and here's what we have in store for you. It's just over 24 hours after State Capture Inquiry Chairperson handed over the much-awaited parts of his final report. We continue to tease aspects of it. With more than 250 of its 1,000-plus pages devoted to Prasa, including a recommendation that a separate, full-on commission of inquiry be considered, we speak to the woman who once led the board that inherited the mess.
I occupy many positions.
Yes.
Yes. Every position within the SABC, I went through all the steps within the organization.
Yes.
Except the chairperson of the board.
But now the former SABC COO must pay up for abusing those positions for his personal benefit, failing which he'll go to jail. We speak to the person who spilled the beans about him at the commission.
The President is committed to consider the Commission's report in its totality and to present a comprehensive response and implementation plan to Parliament. The Presidency will therefore not respond at this stage to specific aspects of the Commission's findings and recommendations.
The Presidency not so keen to respond to the Commission's rather unflattering statements on the President. But what can Cyril Ramaphosa do in the 4 months he says he needs to redeem himself? My last guest will be from a leading think tank. The Watchdog starts now. Well, before we get to this evening's interviews, let's look at the rogues gallery that has emerged from this report, some of whom we'll be talking about during our conversations in the next hour. The Commission report has recommended that SABC recoup costs it incurred for the New Age newspaper breakfast broadcasts, implicated in the irregular awarding of the contract. Former SABC CEO Lulama Makgobo, who the report recommends should be criminally charged. Former SABC COO Hlaude Motsoeneng has also been implicated in the deal involving the TNA breakfasts. Alongside the criminal charges, the report has recommended that Motsoeneng also pays back an 11 million rand success fee that he was paid by the organization during his tenure. On the Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa, the Commission has found that its former CEO, Lucky Montana, should be investigated in relation to his accusation of a slew of properties while at the helm of the entity. Montana is accused of interfering in the work of the Prasa Board. The Commission has found that the requirement that the State Security Agency report to a minister paved the way for interference at the operations of the SSA. Zondo found that crippling the SSA was instrumental to the state capture project and that the establishment of the commission itself would not have been necessary had the SSA detected and investigated symptoms of state capture. Former Ministers of State Security, Siyabonga Cwele and David Mahlobo, are said to have interfered with the work of intelligence, with the report recommending that the two be investigated by law enforcement agencies. On Cwele, the report has found that he allegedly stopped a probe into the Gupta family. The report goes further. It says Mahlobo was part of covert operations like Operation Justice, where judges were bribed, and that he used the SSA monies to fund ANC campaigns, which he now has to be investigated for. Former SSA Director General Arthur Fraser ran covert operations at the agency. Fraser is accused of also presiding over the Principal Agency Network project, which was established in 2011, but ended up being a playground for corruption, where over 600 million rand was allegedly spent on multiple properties, cars, and computers, which ended up with private individuals. Zendo recommended that Fraser be criminally charged by the NPA and for law enforcement to investigate him. Former Ambassador Thulani Dlomo ran a parallel vetting system among other covert operations within the SSA. The commission has recommended that law enforcement agencies investigate him for criminal conduct and the disappearance of SSA firearms. Only some of the people against whom negative findings have been made by the commission, but we're going to end there at least for now. More than 250 of the state capture report's 1,000+ pages are devoted to Prasa, the passenger rail company owned by the state and which is supposed to be the backbone of South Africa's public transport system. The commission found extensive evidence of malfeasance. The rot went deep and wide. Yet, Judge Zondo and his team felt so much was still uncovered that in fact they are recommending a separate, full-on commission to look into what happened at that agency. Potentially, what could still be uncovered is the question. And to help us navigate the issues raised in the report is Ms. Khanyisile Kweyama, who is Prasa's former chairperson. Ms. Kweyama, good evening. Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Good evening, Vuyo, and thank you for having me this evening.
Just from what you've been able to read, your takeaways, or what stood out for you?
Vuyo, what stood out is that perhaps many of the issues that were known about Prasa have now emerged, or rather were not known about Prasa have emerged. And I fully support what the now Chief Justice has said about a more detailed investigation into Prasa. As you will be aware, I mean, you've obviously mentioned the former CEO, Mr. Montana, as one person that recommendations have been made against. But in this report, also a number of executives have also been listed as requiring further investigation as to whether they should be prosecuted relating to the tenders and the malfeasance at Prasa. This is what we found when we were at the board of Prasa that I chaired, is that many of the executives at Prasa have been involved. And you just find layers and layers of corruption at Prasa that are very difficult to penetrate when you are relying on those very same executives to be the people that run the organization. So as a board, you find a lot of frustration. When we started at the Prasa Board, there were many investigations that had been done by National Treasury. Some of them had been outsourced to private law firms, private investigators, and none of those have actually featured in the current reports. So there is a lot at Prasa that has happened. There are many people who have benefited over the years. It's almost like it's hard to find somebody that was innocent at the executive. And this is not to cast aspersions on the many men and women who are doing a lot of good work at Prasa. There are a lot of whistleblowing reports that were never came to the surface at the commission. As a board, we received many whistleblowing reports that we could not ever conclude in the time that we were there. So further investigation will definitely surface those so that Prasa can recover, so that Prasa can get rid of people who are only there looking for a buck, feeling that if other people have done it, I can also do it. And so that the passengers can get the service that they require, rather than people who are more interested in benefiting from a procurement.
Let's start with the former Prasa CEO, Lucky Montana. A short while ago, he was on our sister program, The Full View. He insists that you can talk about a lot of mistakes that may have happened, but corruption wasn't one of them. Take a listen to what Lucky Montana had to say a short while ago.
But I asked myself, did Chief Justice Zondo assist the country? Because before we look at ourselves, the biggest test of this report is whether it enables us to solve our problems. Of course, we must hold people like myself who are in public office accountable, but also must lay the basis to take our country forward, unite. When I look at that, and having gone into the details of the report, I'm afraid to say that the report fails the biggest test. Currently, I think Chief Justice Zondo has responded so much to those, the gang that calls for, we want to see orange overall. Since I left Prasa, I've been investigated by the Hawks, I've been investigated by the SIU, and I think the result will be the same. If they do a proper investigation, they'll actually find that all the things they're talking about are false. When I testified at the commission, I actually demonstrated to the chairperson of the commission and his team that the Sufambo contract was not a corrupt contract. I actually dealt with the numbers because at the time, Chief Justice was actually banging the table that this contract of 3.5 billion, I said, that's the value of the contract, but we spent only 2.6 billion rands. And if you break down those amounts, you'll see that almost 1.9 billion of that amount went to the business of the trains. You see that 300 million rands of that 2.6 also went to paying SARS tax, and 100 million rands went to about, I think, customs. So that left you with 200 million rands. Now the report takes, it presented as part of its evidence the numbers that were presented by one, I think, Mr. Sachs, who was formerly with one of the companies that was doing the investigations. Those numbers, in fact, are a clear demonstration when you look at the money flows, that you can talk about irregularities or problems there and there, but corruption is not one of those.
Your thoughts on what he had to say?
So I think what Mr. Montana omits to say in his what needs to be checked and what doesn't need to be checked is whether the service was actually delivered, whether the product was actually delivered, and whether it functioned and whether it did serve the passengers as it was supposed to, which it didn't. And you will obviously know the stories about the two toll trains and whether it is valid or not valid. But the bottom line is what we inherited and what we found when we got there was that the product that was delivered was not, what do I call it, congruent with South African standards. What we found in those flow of funds reports was that as soon as money went into an account, it exited the very next day. There are commissions that remained unexplained. So there is a lot behind that. And as I say, that this is what Mr. Montana omits to say in his presentation of what Mr. Zondo did, or rather Justice Zondo did or did not do. And I think that's what lies at the heart of corruption, in that what went into people's pockets as opposed to what went into delivering the product. And we cannot by any means say that just because we brought this new invention to South Africa, therefore everything else should not be looked at, because there you see the train standing there. So, yeah, there is a lot more to be answered. And my view of the report and what the findings have been is that, like any court of law, everybody presents their side of the story, and the adjudicator, who is the Chief Justice in this instance, makes a ruling together with the teams of legal experts that were surrounding him. And I cannot now cry foul when the verdict and all the evidence shows that there was malfeasance in the organization.
I mean, recently, Prasa came before Parliament, and among the things that were said was that they need 1 billion annually for security over the next 3 years. They were also, of course, bemoaning, the theft of, in fact, this is in part is to protect or to deal with the issue of copper theft, vandalization, and so on. If there wasn't the malfeasance we are talking about, or that has come through from testimonies of people who came before the commission, do you think that Prasa today would be sitting with such problems?
Probably not. Without malfeasance, there was enough funding, the budget was there to deliver and to ensure that everything functions. I mean, you've touched on another area, which is security, that over the years, security contracts were awarded at Prasa that were irregular, that did not deliver on what they were supposed to deliver. And the sadness of inheriting such a system is that when it hits the ceiling, it almost looks like you who were sitting there at the time did not do your work. But indeed, it's stuff that has been building up over the years where companies were paid and did not do their work. The infrastructure at Prasa was being destroyed long before today. Companies were paid, but thieves would come in and rob, while security companies were paid to be at Prasa. So a lot could have been achieved had people been doing what they're paid for and people being delivering the service that they are supposed to deliver. I mean, there were security cameras that were supposed to be installed at stations. On one of our first visits, we went around all the stations in Gauteng, in other provinces, and the security cameras were not functioning. In some of the stations, we found that the security cameras were even facing the wrong direction, which shows that nobody ever followed up after they were installed to do quality control, to see that they were functioning. And those are things that you end up dealing with instead of focusing on the strategy, which is what a board is appointed to do. So too many people didn't do their work because they didn't care. They knew that I've paid somebody to give me this contract and I don't have to deliver because whoever was the recipient is happy with whatever money he has received. I mean, lifestyle audits, that is something that is still outstanding at Prasa because there was there were many people who lived lifestyles that were not consumerate with the salaries that they were earning, and you wonder where that is coming from. So once again, yes, further investigations will show that. And I guess Mr. Montana is saying to what end, how much do you have to dig? But I think even talking as a citizen of this country and everything that we see happening in the streets, people unhappy with service delivery, people feeling that enough is enough. Those people are owed to get the truth so that we can start rebuilding, because we can never rebuild if it's based on a false premise.
But then, someone else might say, look, this particular commission has cost a lot of money already. And I've had a number of people saying it's understandable that it has taken so long, that it has cost so much already, even though some say, the amount of money spent, almost $1 billion or thereabout, doesn't justify, what has actually come out of it. Maybe we should stop right here. Forget perhaps about, yet another inquiry that may take time, lots of extensions, and at the end of the day, still not address, all the challenges facing these state-owned enterprises. Should a case, or can a case not be made for saying, you know what, whatever the state capture inquiry has revealed up until now, let's take that as lessons to be learned, get those who have been caught to their hands on the till, to pay back the money or be prosecuted. Let's learn lessons from everything that has happened, but perhaps use whatever money we're going to throw into a commission to actually give a Prasa what it needs right now, the billion or so it says it needs for security, to make sure that it goes back to delivering on its mandate. What would be your view if someone was to make that argument?
Vuyo, I think there is merit in saying, call it a day somewhere and move on, because you could be in commissions of inquiry and investigations for the next 20 years. But I think the negative of that is that those who probably got away with things and are just below the radar would then think, oh, well, I got away with it this time and I can continue because I'm not of that profile that I can, that I will be in the spotlight and I will therefore be investigated. So that is the one risk. I'm all in favor of a TRC, for lack of a better word, where if people are willing to come out and tell the truth and reconcile, for lack of a better word, if that can be a form of a process that is undertaken. I'm no expert on those, but I'm just talking now as a citizen who also wants to move on and see service delivery happening. So it's not about not having a commission of inquiry. It's probably about the nature of the commission of inquiry and what the terms of reference would be to ensure that it doesn't go into another 3 years and it doesn't go into extra expenditure. I made the example to you of previous investigations that were conducted by National Treasury at Prasa, any expenditure above 10 million. And I think it's sad, and it's a travesty of justice, really, that those end up lying in a shelf somewhere, gathering dust. When we're at Prasa, we then call the SIU in at some stage to look at those contracts and to take matters forward. And I think an exercise would need to be done to determine how far the SIU has gone ever since there's now a new board in place. Have they taken those forward? So do almost like a check, or a reality check on all the investigations that have been done, and don't start the ball, or rather the wheel turning from the beginning. Rather start at a point, because yes, there is also investigation fatigue that then kicks into an organization. When too many investigations have been done, the same people are expected to come and give evidence and all that type of thing. So I'm in support of a form of a process, but I do agree that it has to have limitations and it has to take on a lot of the information and investigations that already exist and conclude them and take them on to the next step rather than reinvent the wheel.
Two issues I want to very quickly, I know I've got to let you go now. I want to canvass with you, one coming out of this report, but also an issue that people have been talking about on the back of what we have seen and heard from the very first report that Judge Zondo came up with. One is the power of politicians to appoint board members at state-owned enterprises. The view of the Commission is that this should be diluted to avoid the recapture of state firms. A quick one on that.
I agree entirely. And, I've been both on the boards of SABC and the boards of Prasa, and one does know the harm that can happen with political interference. So that does need to be relooked at, and so that the boards are completely independent. At this stage, the boards are not independent. I've had examples when you've planned something as a board and a minister then comes and like, okay, this is how I'm going to do it. So that needs to be changed indeed, so that the boards can do the jobs that they're supposed to do and be independent.
And one of, the other things that have come out of this process has been the protection of whistleblowers on the one hand, and on the other, support but also protection given to those who move into these entities, try to turn them around, try to get these entities to go back to their respective mandates. Once upon a time, while you were the chairperson of the board, you were hijacked, kidnapped, pepper sprayed, bundled into a boot of a car, driven around for a good few hours. Just your thoughts on the protection of both whistleblowers, but also of those who then, have the courage to move in and start turning the situation around.
Absolutely, Vuyo. And, protection to both. And protection doesn't mean 1,000 bodyguards. Protection just means the ability to do your work without interference, without fear or favor, and without the risk to your life, as has happened not only in my instance, but other people at Prasa and other state-owned entities who had their lives threatened. So the protection is very important, and that needs to be written into some statutes to ensure that the consequences of threatening people and the consequences of actually carrying out actions against people who all they want to do is do a good job for their country should be ensured.
I want to thank you very much for your time this evening. She is, of course, a former board chairperson of Prasa. More than 250 pages of the more than 1,000 pages or so report devoted to Prasa. The commission also recommending that a further full-on inquiry be instituted. After the break,
I occupy many positions.
Yes.
Yes. Every position within the SABC, I went through all the steps within the organization.
Yes.
Except the chairperson of the board.
well, the commission says he and others must pay up for their role in messing things up at the public broadcaster. Former SABC COO Hlaudi Motsoeneng must pay up for abusing the positions he held for his personal benefit, failing which he'll go to jail. Yunus Karim spilled the beans about him at the commission. He joins us on the line. Yunus, good evening. Thanks very much for your time.
Good evening to you and your listeners.
A bit of context, perhaps, to what you told the commission, in particular about the multi-choice issues.
You want me to say something about that?
Yes.
Well, basically, my own view, as indeed the view of the Department of Communications at the time, was that the deal served to entrap, if you like, the SABC to opt for its rejection until then, and government's policy until then, of STP encryption or control, if you like. In other words, the aim there, as set out since 2008, when the minister was Ivy Matsepe-Kasaburi, and set out, of course, in two national conferences of the ANC, not least the December 2012 conference, was that we need to encourage competition in the pay TV sector. And one way of doing that was to have set-top box control stroke encryption. Let's use the words interchangeably, though they mean something slightly different. And the SABC held to that view, which is consistent with the government view, until this deal came about, which provided in the actual contract something that's wholly irrelevant to the contract, which is that if the SABC were to air its 24-hour channel, news channel, and yet another channel of entertainment on DSTV, they would have to change their policy, which is what they did. Now, we felt as a department and government that it was inappropriate for such a decision to be taken by the SABC because of pressure from a private sector monopoly.
Was it, I mean, in your view, just about money? In other words, someone going to, or some people going to benefit? Or was it about ignorance, of what the policy was, what the ANC had decided, which of course would have informed a policy, or both?
I think it was mainly a search for personal gain, because the positions of the ANC and government until then were very clear. And of course, Mr. Motsoeneng was to benefit, I think, to the tune of 33 million or so because of this contract that he claims to have secured, which he, of course, signed against the delegations of authority. Only the SABC CEO could sign that. So I think I haven't unfortunately had time to read the Zondo Commission report fully. I just browsed through it very quickly in anticipation of this interview, and I'll look at it over the next few days. But what I understood the Commission to have said is that the deal was struck outside of the framework of the delegation of authority, and it was irregular. And clearly, already, as you know, in the court processes, Mr. Motsoeneng has been asked to return the 11.4 thereabouts millions that he got from the SABC for securing this deal. And I believe that there's some process unfolding with his lawyers and SABC lawyers about retrieving that money. So clearly, they knew what they were doing. They were very aware. And Mr. Motsoeneng was the driving force of this. He was fanatical almost in his view that we should drop encryption. And he was supported fully by the then chair of the board, Ms. Zandile Shabalala. So I'm very clear. I mean, you can look, obviously my affidavits, as indeed Mr. Motsoeneng's affidavits and multi-choices are all on the website, presumably. And it's for people to look at it and make up their own mind about it. Though the Zondo Commission seems to have decided that there was nothing irregular about this deal. And that's a view I respect. I mean, I think the Zondo Commission has done great work. I mean, the ANC, Alliance, government, parliament need to address their recommendations. But for now, from what I can tell from the reports on it in the mid-media, they've done a superb job. I have the highest regard for the Commission, and I think we really must implement as much of it as is reasonably possible. But there are obviously, in a report of some 5,000 and more pages, inaccuracies, and certainly that applies to the section I browsed through. But I won't go into that. I respect the view of the Commission, but certainly I still hold the view that it was regulatory capture. Now, the Commission argues that that's outside the ambit of the proclamation, the terms within which they carried out this inquiry. But regulatory capture, it seems to me, needs to be applied, it needs to be addressed as part of state capture. It's a particular form of state capture where the company or individual doesn't pay bribes for a tender or goes into collusion with an official making a decision on the very same tender and the like. Here it is about changing government policy through various means that actually border on certainly immoral conduct. And I think it should be unlawful. The Commission suggests, I think, that the members' ethics code for parliamentarians, government officials, and the government itself should be there, which is what I had suggested on behalf of the DOC at the time. But also, I really think that there should be some regulation. I think the Commission says that there's a fine line between vigorously lobbying, as Multi-Choice did, and seeking unlawful advantage. And I think that matter needs to be addressed by Parliament and government. Yes, certainly.
In fact, I was going to go into that issue, but I'll skip it since seeing that you have mentioned your latter point, that is. Now, let's talk about two other things. One is the selling of, archives, SABC archives to ANN7. Yes,
the archives are sold astonishingly to Multi-Choice. Now, we didn't argue in DOC that that was illegal, so much as it gave Multi-Choice a tremendous advantage. Our own experts, independent and within the department, assessed that the amount paid for the access to that historical archive was far exceeding the amount that Multi-Choice paid for it. Moreover, it was a decision taken without approval of the board or the shareholder. I mean, ultimately, the government is the custodian of the country's history when it comes to TV. The SABC belongs to the public. It is the board and, in fact, the government as the shareholder that needs to protect that. Now, that was done without the consent of government. And, in fact, the Commission says somewhere that the board did subsequently approve of that. But, yes, that's the point. They approved it in 2013 September. 2014, I think it was, or September, 6 months after the July, I think it was, signing of the agreement. So, in short, what are the things that I think should be drawn from this? And some of it overlap what the Commission might say, and some of it doesn't. One is, I think, that there needs to be some clear...
Just before you get there, can I just chip in before you get there, because I want you to end on that point. I just want to go into the Gupta breakfasts before I ask you about, the things to avoid and how we move forward, given the lessons that may have been learned from this whole process saga during these years. Because for a while, Hlaude Motsoeneng and whoever was with him at the time argued, quite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Of course, that, these were good for the SABC. Platforms were being provided for ministers and a whole range of other people, to come and talk about the work that they were doing and so on, in spite of the fact that some was arguing that there's something fundamentally wrong with how this whole thing was being done, where the SABC was paying both through numbers, but also not making money. In fact, if anything, I remember being hounded by the then board chairperson of the SABC or the former chairperson of the SABC, when we went to Parliament and said this was just wrong and very costly to the SABC, and would be proven right later on. But what are all these things saying about the way, the SABC has been run over the years, but in particular, the role of those who were supposed to be or were supposed to in charge of or drive a policy, because it extends. In other words, it goes beyond the Gupta breakfast. It goes beyond, the controversy and corruption around, the selling of archives. It goes to bigger issues like the opening of airwaves, which was supposed to happen, but never really happened, because by the time processes were started, the train had long left, the station. We can go on and talk about things like, the public service mandate of the SABC, which was never really funded or thoroughly discussed and arrived at where everyone would arrive at a point at which we would know how to proceed. So all these things brought together what, as a former minister, in charge of this particular space, would say are the lessons to be learned here and things to avoid going forward.
Firstly, many of the things you say are correct. I'm not going to respond to each of them specifically, given the time constraints. But the first is, I was only there for about 10 and a half, 11 months, okay? But to the extent I didn't do enough as an oversight minister, I accept the responsibility, and I'm happy to be criticized by, the Zondo Commission doesn't address that specifically, but any member of the public, the NGOs, whoever. So I accept, in that 11 months, maybe I could have done more. But let me put this to you. There are some obvious things that NGOs, Parliament's inquiry of 2018, was it? The ad hoc committee and so on have suggested. All of that should be implemented. In fact, for the first, let me put it like this. My own view is, one, that you need some sort of regulatory framework for lobbying, as I've said. Two, I think that the board needs to be very clear about its responsibilities, and the MOI, the Memorandum of Incorporation, needs to be very clear. Thirdly, I think it might even in the incorporation of the Memorandum of Incorporation put out penalties for board members and so on who fail to exercise their fiduciary responsibility. Now, obviously, a minister cannot interfere in the internal affairs of what is a public broadcaster, not a state broadcaster. I'll give you some examples. At the time, the public protector said what she said about Mr. Motsoeneng. I sought legal advice from within the department, and I think the state law advisor to say the board is not acting on that, right? They kept giving me the runaround. And in fact, they kept saying, no, we'll address these issues later down the road and so on. So finally, in despair, I contacted both the department's lawyers and the state law advisor, if I'm correct, and both said you cannot interfere. You cannot instruct the board to suspend Mr. Motsoeneng. So basically, what I think that might be necessary is, without interfering in the internal operational issues of a public broadcaster, there may be a need in the memorandum of understanding, or incorporation rather, and indeed in legislation, of the minister intervening, but only insofar as it's necessary to defend the public broadcaster's interests, if in fact, and the public's interest in the public broadcaster, if the board is not acting as it should. Now, that can be done. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an expert on the media issues, but that needs to be done. Clearly, too, what happened with the CEO signing agreements and so on, we have to clarify who does that sort of thing. It can only be the CEO. So those are some of the things that need to be done. The Zondo Commission doesn't address so much what needs to be done, but I think we need to draw lessons, and these are some of them. And if I had more time and to look at the commission report, and there was more time to speak now, maybe I could have come up with more views. But I think these issues are before the current minister. The current minister should look into it. It's not my job. I'm a former minister, and I think there have been 4 or 5 since I was there. But for what it's worth, those are my views. But really, it's for the government and the minister to address these issues, and I'm sure they will. We went through it for the time. Part of overall state capture, we need to address this too on SABC and multi-choice as part of the overall issues of never, never, never having to be in this situation like we have been. Thank you.
That's where we're going to leave it. Thank you very much for your time. Former Communications Minister Yunus Karim, on the back, of course, of some of the findings of the Commission as well as recommendations. To this now. The presidency was apparently inundated today with requests for comment on the back of unflattering statements made by the president, of the president by the commission. Take a listen to what Vincent Magwenya has to say on the back of those requests for comment.
The President is committed to consider the Commission's report in its totality and to present a comprehensive response and implementation plan to Parliament. The Presidency will therefore not respond at this stage to specific aspects of the Commission's findings and recommendations.
Well, while we wait for the comprehensive response from the president, he said he needs about 4 months to decide what to do with the entire report, and also what he himself, or how he himself has come out of this report, must be said, not smelling of roses. Is there something he needs to do, or he will need to do, to redeem himself? Well, my next guest is Angelo Fick, who is the director of Socio-Economic Research Institute, AWAL. Good evening, Angelo. It's been a while. Hope you're well. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Just your thoughts overall, what the report had to say about the president.
So the report draws a distinction, good evening, Vuyo, between what the president said as president of the Republic of South Africa, yes, and what Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa suggested the ANC did as in his capacity as president of the party. And it found that when he was the deputy president, he was certainly in a position to have acted in ways that were certainly more forceful than he did, and that it didn't always find it so convincing, the commission didn't, when he outlined the limitations of his actions and that he had acted when it was necessary. He had acted in the case of Des van Rooyen's appointment, he'd acted in relation to the banks, but there were all sorts of other issues that the timeline didn't support for the commission, including the fact that that there had been all sorts of media reports about serious allegations and credible allegations of state capture as early as 2011. And then in his role as the ANC president, there were all sorts of queries around how the ANC acted and when it acted. And certainly the commission drew the conclusion that, among other things, the ANC often didn't act in time in relation to the allegations, or sometimes simply collected their own members' complaints but didn't act on them. And that certainly speaks very poorly of all sorts of people, not just Mr. Ramaphosa, who were in senior leadership positions and claimed to have opposed state capture.
Let's talk about him as the deputy president of the country for a second. His view is that, upon being confronted by the fact or reality that he actually failed to speak out, his retort was that, he had to fight it from within. Had he resigned, because he did serve at the behest of, his boss, the president of the country at the time, Jacob Zuma, you would not have seen what eventually happened. In other words, if people like him had simply opted out or had spoken out and then were ejected, a lot of the changes that subsequently came, which South Africans appreciated, would actually not have come. Maybe would still be stuck, where things were at the time.
Except that as Member of Parliament and then later as Deputy President, he took an oath of office to put the country before the party's interests and therefore, additionally, before his own. And so the question that the Commission asked quite explicitly in one of its concluding sections on Mr. Ramaphosa is, what did he know, when did he know it, and what did he do about it? And those are crucial questions to be able to answer. Because if the president didn't know, and he indicated at various points that he only knew as deputy president of specific instances and intervened on those instances, the question is, why didn't he know about the many other instances given what was available in the public? And so what the Commission is suggesting is that inferences drawn from Mr. Ramaphosa's testimony set against the public record is that, all sorts of judgments were made by Mr. Ramaphosa and people in his camp who supported the notion of going up against state capture, that speak to their balancing act, that they wanted to balance out the party's interests and the longevity of the ANC with the continued or with the attempt to undo the damage that was being done in the state. And while the Commission says it cannot engage in counterfactuals, it must be questioned exactly whether or not that decision was necessarily the best decision in the interest of the country. Because what the president proposed, as in his testimony when he accounted for his role as deputy president, was that any other scenario would have been worse. But that we have no evidence to support that. We only have the evidence of his inaction or seeming inaction in relation to what was already in the public domain and what the Constitution and his oath of office would have required of him to do. Because there are all sorts of people across the board who are being recommended for criminal prosecution because they didn't do the due diligence of reporting illegal actions or acting on it. And if we are to protect whistleblowers, really, you cannot have somebody sitting in the deputy presidency position and claim that he didn't know what was on the front pages of newspapers, on the airwaves for radio and television stations, and at the same time claim that he was acting in the national interest. And that, I think, is a conflict that is one that Mr. Ramaphosa is going to have to address in his response eventually, and that South Africans will have to answer for themselves for all public and political officials across party lines in the future when it comes to these kinds of challenges.
In fact, what the Commission also didn't find evidence of was that there would be, or there would have been dire consequences for him had he spoken up or like taken action, that he himself did not provide, that evidence that indeed that's what would have happened had he acted differently in a manner consistent, as you say, with his oath of office.
And acted earlier, and this was the point of the Commission, that the timing of the actions was part of the problem. that by the time Mr. Ramaphosa acted as deputy president, 4 years had passed since the first issues of state capture had come to the public domain. And this has been a problem, I think, for governing parties around the world, but particularly also in South Africa. There's ignoring of the public record because it appears in the media. We've had ministers of government or a minister of government stand up in court and deny that an action that was happening at the time, the leaving of another head of state, that they were required to detain because of their domestication of the Rome Statutes, wasn't happening despite photographic evidence, because he said that is happening in the media, it isn't happening in reality. And this role that politicians play of simply denying the public record by denouncing journalists, while at the same time wanting to use journalists, is something that I think we really in South Africa, on the back of what you've heard from Eunice Karin, have to address, because this is where public interest broadcasting and public broadcasting and public interest media are very, very important.
Your thoughts on one of the big recommendations, that the Constitution be allowed to, or be changed rather, to allow for a direct election of a president? Would that necessarily solve, the problem? I mean, one looks at the American system where you have a two-party system, essentially. They elect president, directly, even though they have to go through the primaries and all those things. But would that be the magic wand? Is that what's going to do the trick to avoid what we saw during the Zuma years?
I was surprised that the Commission went in that direction, because that's quite a substantial reform to suggest without a whole series of citations and extant research being given. I'm with Samir Amin, the Egyptian sociologist and economist, who actually in one of his last books, The Liberal Virus, said that one of the problems of democracy is precisely this American system of the presidential system, that it was invented in the 18th century as a replacement for monarchism, which it was trying to displace without replacing. And so the president in the United States works like a monarch. And so the reasoning in that section of the report about how Mr. Trump's election came as a surprise, there was no surprise to that. The entire system is designed to elect those kinds of people and have historically elected them. And in South Africa, I think an elected executive president is not going to undo problems. In fact, it's going to make it worse. If you look at contemporary France, it is the epitome of the kinds of problems where a republicanist system with an executive president directly elected is not resulting in better governance. In fact, quite the opposite. And so I'm with Samir Amin. I don't think that that's a solution to South Africa's problems. What I think is a far more thoroughgoing overhaul of the party to constituency system and a rethinking of the way in which ordinary South Africans can access representation in national and other legislatures.
Angelo Fick, let me thank you very much for your time and insights this evening. He is, of course, Director of Economic Research Institute, AWAL. And that's where we're going to leave it for this evening. To join us again tomorrow night, same time, 8 p.m. sharp. Have a good night.